Thanks, Nikki. All right. Okay. So just wanted to revisit the pathways that we showed folks last week. Most institutions think about partnerships in three basic stages: forming, maintaining, and closing partnerships. But in our consultations with Indigenous partners and practitioners, it was really clear that there were two other very important stages in Indigenous community engagement that were being ignored. The first is the work before the work, and the last is the relationship after the work. Today we'll be focusing on the work before the work, and I'd like to start off by sharing with you the story of when I realized I had to do the work before the work. So I started working at the University of Manitoba in the fall of 2014. Within the year, thanks to changes in staffing, I became the coordinator for an Indigenous youth mentorship program in Skowhenan First Nation, as well as a food security program with Cree partners in Northern Manitoba. Right away, I became really aware that I had no real relationships with First Nations people and only knew a few things about the history of colonization and about the experiences of anti-Indigenous racism from my undergrad at the U of W. So who was I to be running an Indigenous youth mentorship program? As you've probably guessed by now, I'm not Indigenous, I'm Chinese. I grew up with my brother and parents in a big household of grandparents, aunties and uncles and cousins, all from my mom's side, who had come over as refugees from Laos in the late 70s and early 80s. And though we lived in the West End and had a restaurant in the North End, my family stayed pretty separate from our Indigenous neighbors and held some anti-Indigenous ideas passed on from other newcomers, the media, and the Canadian immigration system. So here I was, a Canadian-born Chinese woman with not much education and no experience working with Indigenous communities, in charge of a mostly Indigenous program portfolio. Unfortunately, this isn't really a unique scenario. We often see a lot of positions held by non-Indigenous people that should not be. It should be held by Indigenous people. Since then, through conversations with colleagues and mentors and my elder, I've learned that sometimes we're called upon to temporarily share the work or to share our gifts, and other times we're given this chance to learn, and it's a benefit to us that we're learning, but then it comes with responsibilities as well. And one of the long-term changes that ended up happening was we hired Nikki, and Nikki now is the coordinator for the Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program. In 2015, though, I did not have all of these reflections. All that I was feeling was lots of apprehension and uncertainty. So I started to reflect on my new portfolio, what I was being asked to do and how I would need to prepare myself for that work. I really felt this strong responsibility to start building my knowledge and understanding of Indigenous perspectives and to get connected to local communities. I kept thinking to myself, how am I supposed to facilitate community engagement training when I haven't had any experience myself? I felt the need to walk the talk, so to speak. And so I did it the only way I knew how. I turned to community. Luckily, I'd had the experience as a young adult doing lots of community work and learning from community. And I had heard about Meet Me at the Bell Tower, which is a weekly gathering in the North End, started by Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, or AYO. And it was a launching pad for many Indigenous and non-Indigenous community organizers. I'd only been to Bell Tower once or twice before, but that summer I started to go each Friday. I also started going more regularly to the Native Studies Colloquium Series and Fireside Chats at the Indigenous Student Center here at the University of Manitoba. Right away, I could feel the difference in the way that Indigenous events were organized, how people welcomed and spoke to each other, shared food and gifts, and centered relationship, ceremony, and protocol. I watched and I learned, and I made myself jump in, helping out with setup and teardown or washing the dishes, and participating in conversations and sharing circles. The experience of being in community helped me to develop my literacy. How did people relate to each other? What was important to the community? What did I still need to learn? One important thing that I did learn is that it's really important to show up. Indigenous community members are pulled in 10 directions to consult, educate, and advise. But in reality, there are many, many existing opportunities for us to learn that welcome people from all walks of life. We have to be willing to show up and learn in Indigenous spaces, from Indigenous people, and in Indigenous ways. Becoming a part of the Bell Tower family has been the foundation for my work with other Indigenous communities. And from this, the university and I have both benefited greatly. And as I mentioned earlier, this learning and benefit comes with responsibility too. I didn't start going to Bell Tower to create a partnership, but soon after developing relationships, I also started developing accountabilities to this community. This led to more opportunities to help out with new projects, and also to the need to always be thinking about the ways that I can show my gratitude, to extend opportunities to people, to share resources, and to work towards a sense of reciprocity with the community that has given me so much. Finally, I wanted to end with a reflection about personal responsibility. It might not come as a surprise to many people, but this work of relationship building has had to happen above and beyond my paid position. The university is still learning about the value of relationship building, which can often take a long time and has no guaranteed outcomes of partnership. But regardless of the lack of institutional recognition and support for this work, the work before the work still needs to be done. And this is a photo at Bell Tower, which used to take place every Friday in the Indigenous Family Center. And now they just started doing it online again remotely. So if folks are interested, they should go visit that page on Facebook. Okay, so I share that story because for me, it really reflected what I had to learn when it came to just figuring out what I needed to do and what my responsibilities were at the start of this experience of working with Indigenous communities. And you can see here a little close-up shot of the pathway where we've highlighted 3 of the priority principles for this stage, which are literacy, reflection, and relationship. Many people make the mistake of proposing collaborations and partnerships with Indigenous people and communities without having first built a foundation for working in good ways. And this work before the work will look different in each community, since every nation has its own unique history, culture, and practices, and even individuals and groups from within the same community might have different values and ways of working. But in general, the partners and practitioners we spoke to talked about the importance of developing our literacy in Indigenous topics, engaging in critical self-reflection, and building personal and trusting relationships. These are the key principles for this stage of the pathway, but they also inform all of the other stages that follow. The principles in the framework are not in a checklist order. They actually inform and are a holistic guide that infuse all of our practices. Even as we develop our literacy at the beginning, we have a responsibility to continue maintaining our literacy and reflecting on ourselves and our work and deepening those relationships as we go on. So the most common response that we've heard from folks when we share this stage, the work before the work, is that there isn't time or the schedule doesn't allow for it. And our response to that is that it's necessary, possible, and good to do. When we don't do the work before the work, we are much more likely to experience distrust and disinterest from potential partners. This is because of colonialism. People have experienced lots of terrible engagements, lots of harm, particularly working with universities. We are colonial institutions. If your project's already underway, not doing the work before the work might mean that you're imposing university goals or working in ways that actually are to the detriment of communities, or might even have harmful impacts. Ultimately, Indigenous community participants have asked us to do this work, so it's necessary. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous practitioners have put in the time and energy and shown us that the work before the work can be done. It's just a different way of working. And so if you want to work with Indigenous people, can you work in the way that people are asking us to? And finally, those same practitioners have experienced stronger relationships, stronger partnerships, and Indigenous-led collaboration because they did the work before the work. So it has good outcomes, it has good results. If you are unwilling to do the work before the work, to develop literacy, to engage in critical self-reflection and build relationships, not just partnerships, then it's time to reflect on the motivations for working with Indigenous communities. We should only work with Indigenous communities if we are able to work in Indigenous-led and determined ways. So I'm going to do a little rundown of the 3 priority principles. So this first area of literacy, the partners identified 3 important areas for us to do some learning. We have a responsibility to know about the colonial project and how the colonial project has and continues to impact Indigenous communities with whom we are building relationships. This includes learning about the history of colonization and the reality of ongoing settler colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. We also need to know about Indigenous resistance and resurgence, both historic and present day. Sometimes we learn about what has gone wrong without learning about all of the positive, strong aspects of Indigenous culture and histories. So we can't be one-sided about it. And then perhaps most importantly, we need to learn about community-specific histories, cultures, and experiences. This includes things like community protocols and ways of living, how people relate, communicate, and work. There's a danger of approaching our work with a pan-Indigenous lens, and that is just another form of assimilation and colonialism. Okay, we're going to do a quick little pop quiz to assess our literacy. These are some of the things that the partners said that people should know. So Hedda, if you could launch the poll. So you can just check off the things that you feel like you have some knowledge about. So if people mentioned these words or we're having a conversation, you feel like you could say, yes, I've heard about it, I've read about it, I've talked about it. You don't have to be an expert though. There are 3 questions if you scroll down. I don't know if is it working?
How do I participate? I think
Nikki, the co-host, can't participate, but
oh, okay.
Can other folks click? You know, I'm gonna blame Zoom if you can't.
Oh yeah.
Oh, there we go.
It looks like folks are okay.
It is anonymous, so no one will actually see what you click. It's just to get a general sense in this Zoom room of our literacy right now, and these are topics that folks have said are important for people to know if they want to work with Indigenous communities. I use the acronyms on purpose. All right, we're gonna give that just a few more seconds, and then Hedda, you can just decide when you want to close it.
Okay, let's do a quick countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's still so many answers coming in, so maybe I should.
Okay, well we can wait. You can just.
It looks like it stopped. Thank you
Once it
everyone
slows down.
for participating.
Okay, great. Okay, there we go. So folks, you can take a quick scroll through. So these are all things that the communities that we partner with told us people should know. So you can take kind of a glance at 2/3 of the group, what we know a lot about, right? And what we need to work on still. And as you can see, much of the community specific practices is actually where we need to do the most work. And that's not surprising because that is the hardest work to do when it comes to literacy. It's easier to learn about general history, but you need relationship to learn about those community specific histories. You can see here residential schools and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are topics that folks have learned more about and know more about. Okay. All right. Important to note that when you're developing your literacy, that we should think about how we're learning as well. The how is really important. Of course, take advantage of all the different sorts of mediums you can do, right? So learning online, learning through reading, but also think about Indigenous pedagogies that you could engage in, and experiential pedagogy. So learning through experience on the land and in community, learning through story and relationship from our children and from our elders and from our peers, and also understanding that developing our literacy needs to be self-directed to learn the basics, because people are working really hard and we should do some of the work that is widely available. Literacy is also lifelong learning. We can't just learn something now and expect that in a year or two that will be sufficient. We have to continue to update what we learn. One thing to note about the pedagogies is that when you are invited to participate in Indigenous spaces, that you have a responsibility to hold and make space for Indigenous people. We're in a time where some folks have more privilege and access than others. And as a non-Indigenous person, we really don't want to be displacing people from accessing ceremony and community and other things like food at a feast. And so be responsible and take care of yourself and humbly participate if you're invited, but be aware of what's happening around you. You may need to sit out of the sweat lodge so that people can go in. And that's something that we should do with like critical awareness. All right, the next principle, we do have some resources, so we will also share these in the mail out afterwards. There's so much programming available. I once had a sit down with Christine from the Indigenous Student Center, Christine Sear, and we just talked about like how much programming there is and how much people love when you go to the programming that's existing. So I really encourage folks to attend fireside chats. The Native Studies Colloquium series just started, and now that these are online, they're actually open to everyone. You don't have to be at the U of M. So if you're joining us and you're not from the University of Manitoba, I encourage you to check out the links that we'll be sending out in the mailing list afterwards. Okay, so the next principle I wanted to briefly talk about was the principle of reflection. Engaging in critical self-reflection is a central practice for developing self-awareness. And we need self-awareness if we want to work in good ways. It's particularly important to recognize our positionality. So where do we sit within the settler colonial state? And in relationship with Indigenous people and land, and what are our responsibilities, our roles and responsibilities as treaty beneficiaries. As long as we live and work on Indigenous lands, our relational accountability with Indigenous people, communities, and lands exists. This is outside of and beyond the formal partnerships we might form as university staff and faculty. On the screen right now is a list of key areas for critical self-reflection in the stage of the work before the work. So these are things that we've identified as being particularly important right at the beginning. There's more critical self-reflection that needs to happen, but it's really important for you to know who you are and where you come from outside of your work and your study. To know how you may be perceived and being ready to earn people's trust rather than expecting them to just trust you outright. And this is, again, within the history and context of colonial harms that are done by universities to communities. We also need to know our motivation and capacity for working with Indigenous peoples. We'll do an exercise about motivation later. And then all of the other things that are listed, right? Knowing ourselves, how we work and relate, when we're going to be uncomfortable and how we're going to manage that culture shock and debrief those needs without burdening our Indigenous partners or colleagues without making those arrangements ahead of time. And really acknowledging and challenging anti-Indigenous racism in ourselves and others and the communities that we work with, as well as recognizing settler colonialism in ourselves and others. And that this is a lens that we see through, a mindset that we have, and we can reject it. We can decide to align ourselves with the ways of working and the ways of seeing the world of another group and culture rather than the colonial state. All right, the final principle is relationship. Building relationships with new people and communities can be a daunting task, I realize that. particularly if you're engaging with Indigenous communities for the first time. But it's only through relationship that we can earn trust and build a shared understanding and become familiar with each other. And after all of that, that's when there is the possibility that you might receive an invitation to work together. Many of the practitioners that we consulted actually spent significant periods of time developing relationship before establishing partnerships. Folks returned to the same communities over multiple years. They lived in communities for months, attended events for weeks at a time. There's no definite time period in which a trusting relationship will be built. And maybe what's even harder to accept is that there's no guarantee, right? Just because you put in the time doesn't mean that anyone owes you anything. But it shows that you're acting in good faith, that you are demonstrating that you are here to build relationships, and if folks want to invite you to do things, then you're available for that as well. It's our responsibility to put in the time and effort, and then hopefully we'll demonstrate through our actions that we are capable and committed to supporting the vision of Indigenous communities in the way that they want to be supported. Okay, so those are the 3 principles. We are gonna move into the exercise portion of the session now. What we're gonna look at is actually our motivation. So this is one of the tools that we're developing for a reflection exercise for the principle of reflection. And the reason we did it today as part of the work before the work is because it's a central question that you need to explore before you even decide to engage with Indigenous communities. Because we need to know why we want to work with Indigenous communities and whether we're ready to do so. So what we're gonna do is I'll run over this. Nikki and Hedda might have some input here too. You'll have some time to reflect on your own, and then we're gonna go into breakout rooms and discuss our reflections. So on the left side of the spectrum are what is typical in practice for universities. And on the right side of the spectrum is what communities told us they would like to see. If you find yourself resisting the work before the work, you have to pause and think about your motivations and why you're reluctant to engage in this work that partners have identified as necessary. So let's run through these. So the first row, are you arriving in the community with predetermined project goals? Do you already know what you're trying to get out of this? Do you already know what you want to do? Or are you closer to the other side of the spectrum of arriving curious about what the community would like to do and wanting to learn about and support community visions and goals? Second row, do you need communities to sign on to a partnership? Are you in a time-sensitive state already? Or are you closer to the other one? You have the time to build relationships and receive that invitation from community. Third row, are you motivated by funding opportunities and career development? Do you need to publish? Do you need to finish an assignment? Do you have, did you see an opportunity for funding and you applied for the funding first and then you're looking for communities next? Or do you recognize that there is this problematic relationship with the way that wealth and resources are distributed, and you are trying to ensure in whatever ways that you're working with community that they retain ownership, control, access, and possession. So this is referring to OCAP, the research protocols. And finally, in the fourth row, are you operating from a mindset where you need to help a community that is somehow worse off, that you're coming in with a savior complex? Or are you working with a mindset where you belong to a community and you feel a sense of accountability to the community? And from there, you feel like anything you can do will build on strengths, will support visions, and improve not only members of the community's lives, but also your own, because you're in it together. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and think about where you sit on these 4 continuums. Okay, and then Hedda's gonna pop us into breakout rooms at 12:40. So just take a few minutes to do some reflection and thinking, and I think we'll be all over the place. Like we sometimes have like restrictions on the way that we work. Sometimes it's external pressures, but sometimes it's internal, something that we do without realizing it. Sometimes it's a rule that we should be challenging, or a way of working that we should be challenging. So it's okay wherever you are, but the first step is to have that critical awareness of where you are and to think about whether you can shift that at all.
Yeah, I think something, at least for me, that is important to remember is that these are not the boxes where you will always and forever be. Like a lot of us, might begin on the left, and then the more you work with Indigenous communities, you realize that, oh crap, I actually need to change my ways. But it's also kind of the other way, where you get more into the work and then you find the need to publish and find career advancement. So it is constantly reminding yourself of, wait, I need to reflect on my motivation over and over again, because you can easily slide back into the left.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that awareness and being able to be honest with the community that you work with is really key, right? It's not that you will never publish, but do you publish with the support and blessing of the community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great reminder, Hedda, and also to just another reminder that this is a spectrum, right? So you might not necessarily be on either end of the spectrums, but somewhere, in the middle as well, and that's a place that you can be here on these lines. So
yeah, it's definitely not one or the other, or a binary or black and white. It's this sense of more typical ways of working and what Indigenous communities have asked us to do and where we kind of lie at different points.
So I can put people in breakouts at any time.
I think let's just give them another minute or so. And I just wanted to welcome Darian Morton to the call as well. Darian's joining us for the second part of today. Darian, we're just doing a little exercise on motivation, a reflection exercise. So folks are just reflecting on where they sit on each continuum of kind of more typical ways of working in the university versus what the community told us in our consultations.
Sounds good.
We didn't do an exercise today, which is another reflection exercise, but come back on February 11th and we will talk about capacity. And also we'll work through 2 exercises that day. Who we are and where we come from as well. So figuring out your migration story and how to answer the question, where are you from? And the second one is this, what's your capacity? So are you ready to work with Indigenous communities? If you stay for our breakout, our second hour today, we're going to be exploring these discussion questions. So does your project pathway have 5 stages? What stops us from doing the work before the work? And how can we change the way we think about partnerships and how we approach community engagement so that we can center the community and our relationships with the community? So that's the second hour that will be taking place, and Darian Morton is joining us because Darian's one of the folks we consulted, a non-Indigenous practitioner and researcher who did the work before the work and did a lot of relationship building before starting his formal research with AO. Some upcoming events, folks. So the next Lunch and Learn is on literacy. Nikki will be facilitating that one, and it's on Wednesday, February 11th. Oh, I got my dates wrong. Reflection comes way later. We will be launching the framework guide. So there will be an actual PDF with these materials in April 2021. So stay tuned for that announcement. And then we're also developing a student-oriented online course, which will be released in the future. We had to defer to new online courses in recent months. So that one's going to be a little delayed. Okay, so thanks very much, folks. If you have any questions, input, or feedback, please email Nikki Fairland. The mailing list has been in the chat, I think, so go and search for that if you want to stay tuned for reminders and also any follow-up resources that we do send. And feel free to check out our website and also find us on Instagram and Facebook if you want to follow our work. Thanks so much to everyone. Nikki, did you have any closing words?
Nope, not really. Just thanks for everyone for coming. Hope that some of you are going to stick around for the next hour. And sorry for those of you who got cut off in our discussion. But yeah, hope to see you again in 2 weeks when we talk about literacy.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.